Welcome to ArcheVoid, where light ventures into the shadowed corners of the human soul. This is a place where we don't shy away from the difficult questions, but face them head-on with unflinching honesty and uncompromising inquiry. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture yourself in a world where consequences don't exist, where you could act without fear of punishment, judgment, or retribution. If you knew with absolute certainty that you would never be caught, never be held accountable, what would you do? This isn't just a philosophical thought experiment. This question has echoed through history, preceding some of humanity's darkest chapters. From genocides to tyrannical regimes, from the calculated cruelty of serial killers to the shocking brutality of seemingly ordinary people, this question reveals something profound about the human condition. The uncomfortable truth is that evil might not be something that exists out there in others, in the criminals we read about in the news, in the dictators we study in history books, or in the monsters we see in movies. The real horror, the one we desperately try to avoid confronting, is that evil might be residing right here within you, within me, within all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Today, we're going to strip away the comfortable illusions we've built around the concept of human evil. We're going to examine whether our capacity for darkness is something we're born with, encoded in our DNA like an ancient curse, or whether it's something that's cultivated, nurtured, and grown through our experiences and environment. But more than that, we're going to explore the possibility that this distinction itself might be missing the point entirely. For too long, we've approached the question of evil as if it were a distant phenomenon, something that happens to other people, in other places, at other times. We create neat categories: the good people and the bad people, the heroes and the villains, us and them. This psychological distance allows us to sleep peacefully at night, secure in the belief that we are fundamentally different from those who commit atrocities. But what if this very tendency to externalize evil, to project it onto others, is itself part of the problem? Carl Jung, the renowned psychologist, spoke of the shadow, that part of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, the aspects of our personality that we find unacceptable and therefore repress or deny. Jung argued that evil is not an external force, but rather a manifestation of this rejected shadow self. When we fail to integrate our shadow, when we refuse to acknowledge our own capacity for darkness, we inevitably project it onto others. This projection doesn't eliminate the shadow. It simply ensures that it will express itself in unconscious and potentially destructive ways. The implications of this are staggering. If Jung is correct, then our tendency to see evil as something that exists only in others is not just naive, it's actively dangerous. It blinds us to our own potential for harm and creates the very conditions that allow evil to flourish. When we refuse to see the darkness within ourselves, we become vulnerable to its influence. We become the ordinary people who, under the right circumstances, are capable of extraordinary cruelty. This isn't just theoretical speculation. History is littered with examples of regular, decent people who found themselves complicit in unspeakable acts. The Nazi regime didn't rise to power through the actions of a small group of psychopaths. It succeeded because millions of ordinary Germans, people who saw themselves as good moral citizens, either actively participated in or passively allowed the systematic murder of millions of their fellow human beings. But this pattern isn't limited to historical atrocities. It plays out in our daily lives in smaller but no less significant ways. How often do we participate in systems of oppression while telling ourselves we're just doing our jobs? How often do we turn a blind eye to injustice because confronting it would be inconvenient or uncomfortable? How often do we dehumanize others, if only in our minds, to justify our indifference to their suffering? The question of whether evil is nature or nurture becomes less relevant when we realize that the real issue isn't where evil comes from, but how we relate to it. The danger isn't that some people are born evil while others are born good. The danger is that all of us have the capacity for both light and darkness, and most of us are completely unprepared to deal with this reality. In this exploration, we're going to journey into uncomfortable territory. We're going to examine the biological foundations of aggression and violence, the psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil, and the social structures that can transform entire societies into machines of destruction. We're going to look at the neurological basis of empathy and its absence, the role of trauma and environment in shaping moral behavior, and the philosophical frameworks that have attempted to make sense of humanity's dark side. But this isn't just an academic exercise. Understanding the nature of evil isn't just about satisfying intellectual curiosity, it's about survival. In a world where the stakes of human behavior continue to rise, where our capacity for both creation and destruction grows ever more powerful, we can no longer afford to remain ignorant about the darkness within us. The future of our species may well depend on our willingness to confront the shadow that lurks in every human heart. The first step in understanding human evil is recognizing how desperately we want to believe it belongs to someone else. This isn't just a quirk of human psychology. It's a fundamental defense mechanism that shapes how we see the world and ourselves. We create elaborate mythologies around evil, turning it into something exotic and foreign, something that could never touch us or emerge from within us. Consider how we talk about evil in our culture. We use language that creates distance, those people, monsters, psychopaths, terrorists. We consume endless hours of true crime content, not because we want to understand the perpetrators, but because we want to confirm our own fundamental difference from them. We search for the signs we missed, the red flags that should have been obvious, the childhood trauma or brain abnormality that explains everything. This isn't genuine inquiry, it's psychological self-defense. We're not trying to understand evil. We're trying to inoculate ourselves against the possibility that we might be capable of it. This tendency to externalize evil has deep philosophical roots. Thomas Hobbes famously argued that humans are naturally selfish and violent, that our default state is a war of all against all, and that only the iron hand of authority keeps us from tearing each other apart. For Hobbes, evil wasn't an aberration, it was our natural condition, barely held in check by social contracts and the threat of punishment. This pessimistic view suggests that civilization itself is nothing more than a thin veneer over our fundamentally savage nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau took the opposite position, arguing that humans are naturally good and that it's society itself that corrupts us. In Rousseau's view, we're born as noble savages, pure and innocent, only to be twisted and warped by the institutions and structures of civilization. From this perspective, evil isn't inherent to human nature. It's a learned behavior, a product of environmental factors that can, in theory, be corrected through better social arrangements. But both of these positions, despite their apparent opposition, share a crucial flaw. They allow us to maintain the illusion that evil is something that happens to us rather than something that emerges from us. Whether we see evil as our natural state, held in check by society, or as corruption imposed by society upon our natural goodness, we're still treating it as an external force rather than an integral part of human consciousness. Sigmund Freud offered a different perspective with his concept of the death drive, or thanatos. Freud argued that humans possess an inherent drive toward destruction and death that exists alongside our life-preserving instincts. This wasn't evil in the traditional moral sense, but rather a fundamental psychological force that seeks to return all living things to an inorganic state. While Freud's death drive has been largely abandoned by modern psychology, it pointed towards something important: the recognition that destructive impulses aren't aberrations or corruptions of human nature, but integral parts of it. Carl Jung built upon and refined these insights with his concept of the shadow. Unlike Freud's death drive, Jung's shadow wasn't inherently destructive. Instead, it represented all the aspects of ourselves that we find unacceptable and therefore repress. The shadow contains not just our capacity for evil, but also our unrealized potential, our authentic desires, and our creative energies. The problem isn't that we have a shadow, the problem is that we refuse to acknowledge it, and this refusal is what allows it to manifest in destructive ways. Jung's insight was revolutionary, because it suggested that evil isn't something we need to eliminate or overcome, but something we need to integrate and understand. When we deny our capacity for darkness, we don't make it disappear. We simply ensure that it will express itself unconsciously and therefore more dangerously. The person who insists they could never hurt anyone is often the most dangerous, not because they're lying, but because they're genuinely unconscious of their own potential for harm. This understanding was further developed by Hannah Arendt in her analysis of Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. Arendt expected to find a monster, a sadistic psychopath who delighted in suffering. Instead, she found a banal bureaucrat, a man who seemed incapable of thinking for himself and who participated in genocide not out of hatred or sadism, but out of careerism and thoughtlessness. Arendt coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe this phenomenon. The idea that the greatest evils are often committed not by exceptional monsters, but by ordinary people who have abdicated their capacity for moral reasoning. This insight shattered comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil. If Eichmann was representative of how evil actually operates in the world, then we could no longer rely on our ability to recognize and avoid obviously evil people. The real danger came from those who didn't see themselves as evil at all, who were simply following orders, doing their jobs and trying to get ahead in the world. Evil in this view doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It hides behind bureaucracy, ideology, and the mundane routines of everyday life. The implications of this are profound and disturbing. If evil can masquerade as normalcy, if it can hide behind good intentions and legitimate authority, then none of us are safe from its influence. More than that, all of us are potentially complicit in it, whether we realize it or not. The question that haunts us as we contemplate the nature of human evil is whether we arrive in this world already carrying the seeds of darkness within us. Are we born with a genetic predisposition toward violence, cruelty, and destruction? Or do we enter the world as blank slates, only to have evil written upon us by our experiences and environment? The uncomfortable truth that emerges from modern science is that the answer is both more complex and more disturbing than either pure nature or pure nurture would suggest. Scientists have identified genetic variations that appear to correlate with increased aggression and antisocial behavior. The most famous of these is a variant of the MAOA gene, which has been sensationally dubbed the warrior gene by the media. Individuals with certain variants of this gene show reduced activity in the enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. This can lead to increased impulsivity, aggression, and difficulty regulating emotional responses. Studies have found that men with low-activity variants of MAOA are more likely to engage in violent behavior, particularly if they experienced childhood trauma or abuse. But here's where the story becomes more nuanced and more troubling. The presence of this genetic variant doesn't doom someone to a life of violence. In fact, the majority of people with low-activity MAOA variants never commit violent crimes. The gene appears to create a vulnerability, a potential that only manifests under certain environmental conditions. It's not a curse written in our DNA. It's more like a loaded gun that may never be fired, depending on the circumstances of our lives. Neuroscience has revealed equally disturbing insights about the biological basis of evil behavior. Brain imaging studies of violent criminals and psychopaths have consistently found abnormalities in specific regions of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functions like impulse control, moral reasoning, and the ability to consider the consequences of our actions. The amygdala plays a crucial role in processing emotions and triggering fear responses. When these regions are damaged or underdeveloped, individuals may struggle with empathy, impulse control, and moral decision-making. James Fallon, a neuroscientist who studied the brains of psychopathic killers, made a shocking discovery when he analyzed his own brain scan as part of a control group. His brain showed the same patterns of reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala that he had observed in violent criminals. Despite having what he called the brain of a psychopath, Fallon had never committed violent crimes. The difference, he concluded, lay in his upbringing. He had been raised in a loving, stable family environment that had apparently prevented the expression of his neurological predispositions. This brings us to one of the most uncomfortable realizations in our exploration of human evil. The biological capacity for violence and cruelty appears to be universal. Every human brain contains the neural circuits capable of generating aggressive, destructive behavior. The amygdala, which can trigger fight or flight responses, doesn't distinguish between justified and unjustified threats. The dopamine reward system can make us feel pleasure from dominating others or inflicting harm. The capacity to dehumanize others, to see them as less than human and therefore unworthy of moral consideration, appears to be built into our cognitive architecture. Studies of child development reveal that aggressive behavior emerges remarkably early in human life. Toddlers show spontaneous acts of hitting, biting, and taking toys from others, without any instruction or modeling of such behavior. Young children are naturally selfish, impulsive, and unconcerned with the welfare of others. What we call moral development is actually the process of learning to suppress and channel these natural tendencies in socially acceptable ways. The research on mirror neurons adds another layer to this picture. These specialized cells fire both when we perform an action and when we observe others performing the same action. They're believed to be crucial for empathy and understanding others' mental states. But mirror neurons can also make us susceptible to emotional contagion, causing us to unconsciously mimic the emotions and behaviors of those around us. In situations where violence and cruelty become normalized, our mirror neurons can make us more likely to participate in, or at least tolerate, such behavior. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this biological reality is how ordinary and universal it is. We're not talking about a small subset of genetically abnormal individuals who are predisposed to evil. We're talking about fundamental aspects of human neuropsychology that exist in all of us. The capacity for violence, for cruelty, for indifference to others' suffering, these aren't aberrations or mutations. They're part of the standard human package. This doesn't mean we're all destined to become monsters, but it does mean that the potential for monstrous behavior exists within each of us, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to bring it to the surface. The question isn't whether you're capable of evil. You are. The question is what combination of environment, experience, choices, and perhaps luck will determine whether that capacity remains dormant or becomes actualized. The implications of this are staggering. If we all carry within us the biological machinery of evil, then the comfortable distance we try to maintain between ourselves and those who commit terrible acts begins to collapse. The line between good and evil people isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. Instead of being two distinct categories of human beings, we might all be existing on a spectrum, with our position determined not by our fundamental nature, but by the complex interplay of our genes, our experiences, and our choices. The most chilling evidence for the ordinariness of evil doesn't come from genetics laboratories or brain imaging studies. It comes from history itself, from the documented cases of how regular people who could be your neighbors, your co-workers, your family members, have transformed into agents of unthinkable cruelty under the right circumstances. These cases force us to confront a truth that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral character. Christopher Browning's seminal work, Ordinary Men, provides perhaps the most devastating example of this transformation. Browning studied Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German men who were drafted into police service during World War II. These weren't SS fanatics or Nazi ideologues. They were ordinary middle-class citizens from Hamburg, fathers, shopkeepers, clerks, and teachers who had lived peaceful lives before the war. Most had no particular anti-Semitic fervor, and many had even voted against the Nazi Party in elections before Hitler's rise to power. Yet over the course of just a few months, these ordinary men became mass murderers. They participated in the systematic execution of tens of thousands of Jewish civilians in occupied Poland. What makes this case so disturbing isn't just the scale of the killing, but the gradual nature of the transformation. The men weren't forced into participation at gunpoint. Their commanding officer actually gave them the option to excuse themselves from the killing operations without facing court-martial or punishment. Only about 10–15% took this option. The majority chose to participate, not out of bloodlust or hatred, but out of a complex mix of peer pressure, careerism, and the desire not to appear weak in front of their comrades. They gradually became desensitized to the killing through a process of psychological adaptation. What initially made them sick and horrified eventually became routine. They developed techniques to make the killing more bearable. drinking heavily, focusing on the mechanical aspects of the task, dehumanizing their victims by avoiding eye contact or thinking of them as already dead. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of moral erosion, where each small compromise made the next one easier. The men crossed a series of psychological boundaries, each one making it more difficult to turn back. Once they had killed once, refusing to kill again would mean acknowledging the moral horror of what they had already done. It was psychologically easier to continue than to face the full implications of their actions. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments revealed the universality of this phenomenon. Milgram recruited ordinary Americans, not Germans, not Nazis, but regular citizens from New Haven, Connecticut, to participate in what they believed was a learning experiment. Participants were instructed by a man in a white lab coat to administer electric shocks to another person whenever they gave wrong answers to questions. The shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer, eventually reaching levels marked as dangerous and XXX on the shock generator. The person receiving the shocks was actually an actor who wasn't really being harmed, but the participants didn't know this. They heard screams of pain, pleas to stop, and eventually ominous silence from the victim. Despite this obvious suffering, 65% of participants continued to administer shocks all the way to the maximum level when instructed to do so by the authority figure. They did this even though they showed clear signs of distress, sweating, trembling, and verbally expressing their discomfort with the situation. What made people capable of what they believed was torture? It wasn't sadism. Most participants showed genuine distress at what they were doing. It wasn't ignorance. They clearly understood that they were causing serious harm. The key factor was the presence of legitimate authority. The experimenters' calm insistence that the experiment requires that you continue was enough to override most people's moral objections to causing severe harm to an innocent person. Milgram's experiments have been replicated numerous times across different cultures and time periods, with remarkably consistent results. The specific percentage of people who comply with destructive orders varies somewhat, but the basic pattern remains. A majority of ordinary people will cause serious harm to others when instructed to do so by someone they perceive as a legitimate authority figure. The implications of these findings extend far beyond the laboratory. They help explain how genocides happen, how torture becomes institutionalized, how corporate malfeasance spreads throughout organizations. Evil doesn't require evil people. It requires systems that make evil actions seem normal, necessary, or justifiable. When harmful behavior is embedded in institutional structures, when it's broken down into small, seemingly insignificant steps, when it's authorized by legitimate authorities, ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment provided another disturbing glimpse into how quickly normal people can adapt to roles that require cruelty. College students randomly assigned to play guards in a simulated prison began exhibiting genuinely abusive behavior towards students assigned to be prisoners within just a few days. The experiment had to be terminated early because the psychological harm to participants had become too severe. What these studies reveal is that evil behavior often emerges not from individual pathology, but from social dynamics. The capacity for evil is activated by situational factors: authority, peer pressure, role expectations, diffusion of responsibility, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. People don't wake up one morning and decide to become monsters. They slide into it gradually, one small compromise at a time, until they find themselves in a place they never intended to go. This understanding is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means that any of us, given the right circumstances, could become perpetrators of evil. But liberating because it suggests that evil isn't an immutable aspect of character, but a pattern of behavior that emerges under specific conditions that can potentially be recognized and resisted. As we delve deeper into the mechanisms that allow ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil, we encounter perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all: the human capacity to selectively shut down empathy. This isn't about people who are born without the ability to feel for others, though such individuals certainly exist. This is about the far more common and disturbing phenomenon of people who possess perfectly normal empathetic abilities, but can choose, either consciously or unconsciously, to turn them off when it serves their purposes. Neuroscientist James Blair's research has revealed that empathy isn't a single monolithic capacity, but rather a complex system involving multiple neural networks. There's cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what another person is thinking and feeling, and affective empathy, the ability to actually feel what another person is experiencing. These two systems can operate independently, and both can be suppressed or enhanced depending on how we perceive the other person and the situation we're in. Brain imaging studies show that when we view people we consider to be part of our in-group, people like us, people we care about, specific regions of the brain associated with empathy light up automatically. We literally feel their pain as if it were our own. But when we view people we've categorized as outsiders, as threats, or as somehow less than human, these same empathetic responses can be dramatically reduced or completely shut down. The neural machinery of empathy is still there, but it's not being activated. This selective empathy appears to be a feature, not a bug, of human psychology. From an evolutionary perspective, unlimited empathy would be catastrophic. If we felt the pain of every living being with equal intensity, we would be paralyzed by the suffering around us. The ability to limit our empathetic responses to our immediate family, tribe, or social group allowed our ancestors to function effectively and protect their own interests. But this same mechanism that once helped us survive in small groups has become a pathway to enormous evil in our interconnected modern world. Psychopaths represent an extreme version of this empathetic flexibility. Contrary to popular belief, many psychopaths aren't born without empathy. They're simply exceptionally good at controlling when and how they experience it. Neuroscientist Christian Keezers has found that psychopaths can activate their empathetic responses when specifically instructed to do so, but they don't do it automatically. They can choose to feel what you're feeling, but their default setting is emotional detachment. This discovery is deeply disturbing because it suggests that much of what we call evil behavior isn't the result of an inability to understand or feel others' pain. It's the result of a choice not to care. The person who bullies others, the corporate executive who knowingly sells dangerous products, the politician who implements policies that cause widespread suffering, these people often understand perfectly well what they're doing to others. They simply choose not to let that understanding influence their behavior. But the choice to suppress empathy isn't always conscious or deliberate. Much of it happens through psychological mechanisms that operate below the level of awareness. We automatically dehumanize people who threaten us, who belong to different groups, or who stand in the way of our goals. We use language that reduces them to objects or animals. We focus on their differences rather than their similarities to us. We construct narratives that justify treating them as less deserving of moral consideration. These dehumanizing processes are remarkably easy to trigger and can happen with frightening speed. Social psychology experiments have shown that people can be induced to treat others cruelly simply by categorizing them as members of a different group, even when that categorization is completely arbitrary. The minimal group paradigm demonstrates that people will discriminate against others based on nothing more than a random assignment to different colored teams or a preference for different abstract paintings. Once dehumanization begins, it tends to accelerate through a process of moral disengagement. Each act of cruelty makes the next one easier by reducing the cognitive dissonance between our actions and our self-image as good people. We develop euphemisms that disguise the reality of what we're doing. We diffuse responsibility by emphasizing our role as small cogs in a larger machine. We reconstruct our understanding of the situation to make our behavior seem justified or even praiseworthy. This brings us to one of the most troubling aspects of human evil: its frequent disguise as virtue. Throughout history, the worst atrocities have been committed not by people who saw themselves as evil, but by people who believed they were doing good. The Inquisition was carried out to save souls. Slavery was justified as bringing civilization to savage peoples. Genocide has been perpetrated in the name of racial purity, religious truth, or political progress. Evil rarely announces itself as such. Instead, It wraps itself in the language of necessity, justice, and moral improvement. It presents itself as the only rational response to an existential threat. It convinces us that extraordinary measures are justified by extraordinary circumstances. It persuades us that the ends justify the means, that a little cruelty now will prevent greater suffering later. This moral camouflage is so effective because it allows us to maintain our self-image as good people while doing terrible things. We don't have to see ourselves as villains. We can see ourselves as heroes, as people making difficult but necessary choices for the greater good. This psychological comfort is precisely what makes such behavior so dangerous and so common. The systems and institutions of modern society have become remarkably sophisticated at facilitating this kind of morally disengaged behavior. Bureaucratic structures diffuse responsibility across multiple people and departments, making it difficult for anyone to feel personally accountable for harmful outcomes. Specialization ensures that most people only see a small piece of the larger picture, making it easier to ignore the ultimate consequences of their actions. Professional roles and organizational cultures provide ready-made justifications for behavior that would be unthinkable in other contexts. We live in a world where decent people can spend their days designing weapons of mass destruction, manufacturing products they know will cause cancer, or implementing policies they know will increase poverty and suffering, all while maintaining their sense of themselves as moral individuals. The banality of evil isn't just about following orders. It's about the way modern institutions allow us to participate in harmful systems while maintaining psychological distance from the harm we're causing. As we reach the end of this exploration into the nature of human evil, we're left with a reality that is both more disturbing and more hopeful than the simple narratives we usually tell ourselves. The question of whether evil is nature or nurture reveals itself to be the wrong question entirely. The real question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge that the capacity for both profound good and profound evil exists within each of us, and what we choose to do with that knowledge. The evidence is overwhelming and inescapable. You are capable of evil. Not because you are a bad person, not because you lack moral education or proper upbringing, but because you are human. The same neural networks that allow you to feel love and compassion can be hijacked to justify cruelty and indifference. The same cognitive abilities that make you capable of great creativity and problem-solving can be used to rationalize harm and construct elaborate justifications for destructive behavior. The same social instincts that bind you to your community can be manipulated to turn you against those designated as outsiders. This isn't a flaw in human design, it's an inherent feature of consciousness itself. Our ability to engage in abstract thinking, to imagine different realities, to construct complex social hierarchies, and to develop sophisticated technologies has given us unprecedented power over our environment and each other. But power without wisdom is dangerous, and our ethical development has not kept pace with our technological capabilities. The recognition of our own capacity for evil is not meant to induce despair or cynicism. Instead, it's meant to serve as a wake-up call, a recognition that moral behavior isn't automatic or guaranteed, but requires constant vigilance, conscious choice, and ongoing work. The people who do the most good in the world aren't those who believe they're incapable of doing harm, but those who understand their own potential for harm and choose to act otherwise. Carl Jung's concept of shadow work becomes crucial here. The shadow isn't something to be eliminated or transcended. It's something to be acknowledged, understood, and integrated. When we deny our capacity for darkness, we don't make it disappear. We simply ensure that it will express itself unconsciously, where it's more dangerous because we can't recognize or control it. The person who insists they could never be racist, sexist, or cruel is often the most vulnerable to these very tendencies because they haven't developed the self-awareness necessary to recognize and interrupt them. Shadow work involves the uncomfortable process of honestly examining our own motivations, acknowledging our capacity for selfishness, cruelty, and indifference, and taking responsibility for the ways we might already be participating in harmful systems. It means asking difficult questions. What groups of people do I automatically view as less deserving of empathy? What justifications do I use to avoid helping those in need? How do I benefit from systems that cause harm to others? What would I be capable of under different circumstances? This kind of self-examination isn't meant to induce guilt or self-hatred, but to develop the self-awareness necessary for genuine moral choice. When we understand our own vulnerabilities, we can create safeguards against them. When we recognize our capacity for rationalization and self-deception, we can be more skeptical of our own moral certainty. When we acknowledge our susceptibility to group pressure and authority, we can be more resistant to harmful social influences. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to the structures of society itself. If evil is as ordinary and universal as the evidence suggests, then we need institutions and cultural practices that account for this reality. We need systems of checks and balances that prevent the concentration of power in ways that enable abuse. We need cultures that encourage dissent and questioning rather than blind obedience. We need educational approaches that develop not just technical skills, but ethical reasoning and emotional intelligence. Most importantly, we need to create social environments that make it easier to do good and harder to do evil. This means designing institutions that reward empathy and cooperation rather than ruthless competition. It means creating economic systems that don't require people to harm others in order to survive and prosper. It means developing technologies that enhance rather than diminish our capacity for moral reasoning and empathetic connection. The path forward isn't to deny our capacity for evil or to pretend it doesn't exist. The path forward is to face it honestly, to integrate it consciously, and to choose differently. This requires both individual work and collective action. We must each take responsibility for our own shadows, while also working together to create conditions that support our better angels rather than our darker impulses. The stakes couldn't be higher. In an age of nuclear weapons, climate change, artificial intelligence, and global interconnection, our capacity for both creation and destruction has reached unprecedented levels. The old approaches to containing evil through punishment, prohibition, and external control are no longer sufficient. We need a new approach based on understanding, integration, and conscious choice. This is why this conversation matters. This is why we must be willing to look into the abyss of human nature without flinching, not because the darkness is all there is, but because only by acknowledging it can we move beyond it. The light we seek isn't found by denying the shadow, but by courageously facing it and choosing differently. The choice is yours, the choice is ours, the choice is now. Will you have the courage to face your own capacity for evil and choose to become someone who makes the world more compassionate rather than more cruel? Will you take responsibility not just for the good you do, but for the harm you might cause? Will you help create a world where our better angels can prevail over our darker impulses? The future of human civilization may well depend on how we answer these questions. The time for comfortable illusions is over. The time for honest reckoning has begun.